On October 20th, 2011, deep within the Libyan city of Sirte, an elderly man sat hiding inside a drainage pipe, covered in blood. His clothes were torn, his body riddled with wounds, and his hair disheveled. Yet in his eyes there was not the slightest trace of fear, and in his hand he held a golden pistol. But this man was no ordinary individual. He was Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. He was the very Gaddafi who, standing before the United Nations, had branded America as Satan. He was a man who refused to bow down before Western power, so much so that even U.S. President Ronald Reagan, in a fit of rage, publicly denounced Gaddafi as a mad dog. Gaddafi spent his entire life in struggle, sometimes against Western powers and at other times against the internal systems of Libya. Yet, before his death, he accomplished deeds for the Libyan people, for which they still remember him today, and for which they now feel a profound sense of loss. He made gasoline cheaper than water. He established a system of free education and free health care, provided housing for every family, and supplied electricity at virtually no cost. During his rule, the Libyan people lived like royalty. Even if they did not work for a day, money would still be deposited directly into their bank accounts. Gaddafi possessed a truly unique personality. Wherever he went, whether to an Arab summit or an international conference, all eyes were invariably fixed upon him. He would dress in vibrant, colorful attire and wear peculiar hats. He spoke with audacious boldness, eschewing all formalities, and openly mocked Western culture. In the entire world, Gaddafi was perhaps the only man who possessed such audacity. The very concept of fear was alien to him. He would move about openly in public without even wearing a bulletproof vest. Furthermore, he did not reside in a royal palace. Instead, he lived in a tent, much like the Bedouins. Yet this very man, who once dared to look the Western world straight in the eye, was ultimately captured, brutally tortured, and killed by his own countrymen. When images of his lifeless body were made public, the entire world looked on in stunned disbelief. Everyone was left with just one lingering question. Was Gaddafi a hero or a villain? Gaddafi always used to say, "I may die, but I will never abandon Libya." In reality, he truly did not flee Libya like a coward. But what mistakes did he make that led to his own people killing him? In today's video, we will discuss this very topic. On June 7th, 1942, deep within the deserts of Sirte, Libya, a child was born inside a tent, a child named Muammar Gaddafi. His family belonged to a Bedouin tribe. Their lives were extremely arduous. They wandered from place to place across the scorching desert in search of grazing grounds for their camels, sheep, and goats. From his early childhood, Gaddafi, like his father and grandfather, worked as a herdsman. However, his parents harbored a dream that their son would pursue an education rather than spending his life herding livestock. For this reason, he was first enrolled in a madrasa to study the Quran. It was there that a sense of justice first began to take root within him. Subsequently, he moved to the city of Sabha to pursue higher studies. It was from this point onward that he began delivering speeches and demonstrating his leadership qualities. At that time, Gaddafi was a massive admirer of the Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser. Gamal Abdel Nasser had inspired the Arab world with a vision of unity and stood as a staunch opponent of Western influence. In his spare time, Gaddafi would read books authored by Nasser, listen to his speeches for hours on end, and sit in contemplation, asking himself, if Egypt can transform itself, why can't my country, Libya? Upon completing his studies, he joined the army. It was during this period that his rebellious spirit against the West intensified and grew even stronger. At that time, Libya was producing vast quantities of oil. Consequently, by all logical standards, Libya's fortunes should have been transformed. Yet despite possessing this black gold beneath its soil, Libya's fate remained dismal. Poverty was rampant in the villages. People were unemployed, and schools and hospitals were of substandard quality. While the cities had experienced some degree of development, the nation's entire wealth remained under the control of a wealthy elite. During this era, Libya was ruled by King Idris. He was a ruler in name only. In reality, he was merely a puppet of the West. America and Europe monopolized all the profits generated by Libya's oil, while the common people were left to starve. Consequently, resentment against the aging king began to fester among the populace. Meanwhile, broadcasts from Egypt featuring the speeches of Gamal Abdel Nasser resonated across the airwaves, urging Arabs to unite and reclaim power from the clutches of the greedy West. At that time, the Libyan army was home to many patriotic young officers, yet the most fearless name among them was Captain Muammar Gaddafi. He realized that merely voicing grievances against the aging king would yield no results. A concrete plan was essential, for without it, the nation would remain stagnant. He clearly understood that King Idris's time was running out. The people no longer held him in high regard, and he had become the subject of open criticism on the streets. It was at this precise juncture, on September 1st, 1969, that King Idris departed for Turkey to undergo a medical checkup. Seizing this very opportunity, Gaddafi mobilized his military forces to capture both Tripoli and Benghazi. This military coup unfolded with remarkable peacefulness. Not a single person was killed by gunfire, nor were any bombing raids carried out. When the people of Libya awoke the following morning and switched on their radios, they heard the voice of a young man declaring that Libya was now an independent nation, one in which monarchy would no longer be tolerated. Here, the rule of the people would prevail, and this marked the era of Muammar Gaddafi. Thus began Gaddafi's rule in Libya, a reign that would endure for nearly 42 years. Upon assuming power, Gaddafi began making a series of unconventional decisions. Oil had been discovered in Libya in the late 1950s. Naturally, much like in other Arab and African nations, these oil fields were controlled by European and American corporations. These oil companies set prices at their own whim and repatriated more than half of their profits back to their home countries. However, immediately upon taking power, Gaddafi renegotiated all existing agreements. He declared that foreign companies must pay the price demanded by the Libyan state for its oil. Otherwise, they would be forced to leave the country. Gaddafi told them, "Those who have survived without oil for 5,000 years can certainly survive for a few more." Left with no alternative, the oil companies were compelled to accept Gaddafi's terms. This decision by Gaddafi was incredibly risky, yet, remarkably, it paid off. Despite having a population of only 3 million, the nation began retaining 95% of its oil revenues. Consequently, Libya grew wealthy at an astonishing pace. Their fortunes changed overnight. Education, healthcare, and electricity, everything was made free of charge. The government even provided interest-free loans to farmers for cultivation and to entrepreneurs for their businesses. Libya seemed to have suddenly transformed into a utopian dreamland. During that period, the price of oil in Libya became cheaper than that of water. Libya emerged as the wealthiest nation in the Arab-African world. Indeed, the per capita income of its citizens far exceeded that of people in other Arab nations. As time went on, Gaddafi began taking even bolder, pan-Arabist-style initiatives. He resolved to unite the nations of Africa. To this end, he put forward a proposal. We sell our oil in U.S. dollars. However, the dollar is under American control. Therefore, he suggested introducing a new currency, an alternative to the dollar, to be known as the gold dinar. This currency would pose a direct challenge to the U.S. dollar. It was at this juncture that Gaddafi began to be perceived as an enemy in the eyes of the United States. For the dollar, is the very currency that enables America to maintain its stranglehold over the entire world. And if anyone attempts to introduce an alternative currency to it, they are directly challenging America. Saddam Hussein, too, had planned to sell oil to Europe as a means of backing the dollar, and for this very reason, America ousted Saddam Hussein from power. Indeed, this very gold-backed idea eventually cost him his life. However, at that time, the people of Libya did not view Gaddafi merely as a political leader. They regarded him as a guide and a mentor. The Libyan people of that era would often say that had it not been for Gaddafi, they would still be living in servitude today. Yet Gaddafi's true conflict with America began over the Gulf of Sidra. According to international law, a nation may claim sovereignty over the maritime zone extending up to 13 kilometers from its coastline. Gaddafi, however, laid claim to an area extending far beyond that 13-kilometer limit, asserting it as Libyan territory. He even drew an imaginary line across the waters and christened it the Line of Death. He issued a stern warning. Should anyone attempt to cross this line, the Libyan military would open fire upon them. America, however, rejected this claim outright. In a direct challenge to Gaddafi, the U.S. Navy sailed its vessels into the disputed waters. In response, Libya dispatched 2 aircraft to launch an attack on the American naval fleet. Consequently, the U.S. forces returned fire, shooting down and destroying both Libyan jets. Following this incident, America imposed economic sanctions on Libya. However, just a few days later, a bomb exploded at a nightclub in Berlin, killing 2 American soldiers. America alleged that Libya was behind the attack. To exact retribution, America launched Operation Odyssey. During this operation, they killed Gaddafi's daughter. In retaliation for this attack, Gaddafi orchestrated the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Scotland in 1988. This incident claimed the lives of approximately 207 people. In 2003, Gaddafi finally admitted responsibility for the act. From that point onward, Gaddafi began to openly antagonize Western nations, declaring that anyone who opposed Western powers was his ally. He provided financial aid, weaponry, and training to anyone who fought against the West. For instance, he supported Yasser Arafat's PLO in their struggle for Palestinian independence, a cause he championed on the premise that Israel was backed by the United States. He supported Algerian rebels, aided insurgents in Chad, and even lent his support to the Taliban in Afghanistan. Eventually, Gaddafi began to openly declare, "I will destroy America." This proved to be the greatest mistake of his life. In reality, when a ruler remains in power for an extended period and, in the process, transforms the national image, they naturally begin to believe that everything they do is inherently right. Power exerts a profound influence on the human psyche. This is precisely what happened to Gaddafi. So intoxicated had he become by the allure of power that he ceased to care about the West altogether. And a nation like the United States had been waiting for just such an opportunity for a very long time. On the other hand, Gaddafi introduced a distinct political ideology for his people, which he dubbed the Third Universal Theory. He published this theory in the Green Book. Gaddafi rejected both political ideologies of the era, capitalism and Soviet-style communism. In his view, institutions such as parliaments, political parties, and elections were all fundamentally undemocratic. His argument was that when you cast a vote to elect a representative, you are effectively surrendering your own power into their hands. In such a system, your individual voice holds no value. Consequently, he proposed a specific system as a solution to this perceived flaw. He named it the Jamahiriya, meaning the state of the masses, a system in which the people themselves, without any representatives, would directly participate in state decision-making. In reality, however, absolute power remained concentrated in Gaddafi's hands. Anyone who dared to question him was promptly thrown into prison. In fact, he utilized the theories outlined in the Green Book as a tool to maintain control over the Libyan populace. His system of governance resembled a pyramid. Gaddafi sat at the very apex. Beneath him, power was vested in his family and his inner circle of close associates, and at the very bottom stood a formidable security apparatus tasked with the sole objective of suppressing any opposition to Gaddafi. Consequently, a segment of the Libyan population gradually began to resist Gaddafi's rule, for the regime offered no elections, no political opposition, and no independent media. All decisions were dictated exclusively by Gaddafi and his inner circle. Meanwhile, in the eyes of the Western world, he emerged as a formidable adversary. In 1990, at a time when the entire global community was adopting a strictly rigid stance on nuclear proliferation, it came to light that Gaddafi was secretly enriching uranium to develop nuclear weapons. Upon learning this, the nations of America and Europe were plunged into a state of acute alarm. Severe sanctions were immediately imposed on Gaddafi. He was banned from international travel, and his assets held in foreign banks were frozen. It was at this juncture that the Western media began a concerted campaign to tarnish his public image on the global stage, disseminating false narratives and propaganda against him, much in the same vein as they had done with Saddam Hussein. Concurrently, as time passed, Gaddafi's own behavior grew increasingly erratic. He continued to ruthlessly suppress his own people. He would disrupt meetings of the Arab League, going so far as to light a cigarette and blow smoke directly into the faces of neighboring leaders, and would openly mock the United States and Europe. For its part, the United States had been patiently waiting for just such an opportune moment. Then came the year 2010. The people of Tunisia rose up in protest against their country's autocratic ruler. Gradually, the flames of this Tunisian uprising spread across the region, igniting similar movements in Algeria, Jordan, and Oman. By January 25th, the movement had spread to Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and even Libya. The revolutionaries in these nations shared a single objective: to oust their autocratic rulers from power. This wave of unrest across the Middle East came to be known as the Arab Spring, though the spark that ignited this movement had actually originated in the United States. Like the people in other affected nations, the people of Libya, too, sought liberation from Gaddafi's protracted rule. During this period, the popularity of social media surged. In particular, people began organizing protests against Gaddafi on Facebook. The protests first erupted in Benghazi. The people were determined to remove Gaddafi from power. However, would a ruler who had occupied the throne for 40 years willingly relinquish his authority so easily? Gaddafi issued a stern warning. If the protests did not cease, he would kill everyone. He vowed to hunt down the rebels, searching for them house by house, and execute them. This very obstinacy proved to be his greatest blunder. The rebels initiated their uprising by demolishing a specific green building within the city. This structure served as a symbol of the Green Book that Gaddafi had authored. Gradually, the rebellion engulfed the entire city. On February 15, 2011, as the protests reached a critical intensity, Gaddafi deployed the army to suppress the dissent, ordering his troops to open fire on the rebels. This was precisely the opportunity that the United States and Europe had been awaiting. The United Nations authorized NATO to take military action. According to them, Gaddafi was on the verge of perpetrating a horrific genocide, a massacre on a scale the world had never before witnessed. Citing this pretext, NATO spearheaded by the United States and European nations, sided with the rebels and launched a sustained assault on Gaddafi's forces. They systematically destroyed everything in their path: tanks, military bases, air defense systems, and command centers, while simultaneously supplying weapons to the rebels. After several months of intense conflict, the capital city of Tripoli fell under rebel control. Gaddafi fled to his hometown, Sirte. However, during his escape, his convoy was obliterated in a NATO airstrike. Desperate to save his life, the wounded Gaddafi took refuge inside a drainage pipe situated along the roadside. However, the rebels found him very quickly. They dragged him out of the drainage pipe and onto a train, where they began beating him with punches, slaps, and kicks. In the final moments, one of the rebels shot him dead. Had NATO not sided with the rebels that day, Gaddafi might well have succeeded in suppressing the uprising. The United States and Europe, however, were greatly pleased by Gaddafi's death, for it was these nations that had suffered the most from his nationalization of Libya's oil resources. Consequently, the U.S. Secretary of State remarked mockingly, "We came, we saw, and he died." Yet following his death, many believed that peace would finally come to Libya. In reality, the country plunged into chaos and civil war. To this day, the people of Libya feel a sense of regret regarding Gaddafi.